here tonight for number 6 this semester in our series. Senior fellows, people who have all distinguished careers and are still passionate about them. I mean, folks who on Monday morning don't wake up dreading the day. I hope. So we're going to, as we've done before, we're going to just take a quick run through the career of our guest tonight, Andrew Klavan. And then we're going to talk about writing and so forth, and then about halfway through at 7:45 or so, start gesturing and signaling me if I'm going on asking too many questions, because I want to have plenty of time for you all to ask questions about the life, the process of writing, and politics these days, because Andrew has in the past few years gotten very involved in some of the current debates in a way that's pretty unusual for folks who are novelists or involved with Hollywood as Andrew is. Let's start early on. 54 years old and grew up in this area, in fact, on Long Island.
Right? Long Island, great next to you.
Great, Nick. And as we were talking about upstairs, grew up Jewish.
I didn't.
Bar mitzvah at 13.
I was, but in this strange, this very strange upbringing where I was given all the Jewish training, sent to Hebrew school, obviously bar mitzvah. But at the same time, I was very explicitly and implicitly instructed not to take any of it seriously. My mother was and is to this day a complete atheist, and my father was a sort of guilty believer. He was hedging his bets a little bit, but he didn't really know what he thought. But they really didn't believe in the religion. So the effect was that I was being inculcated in something that I was told was essentially nonsense. And the result was that I felt completely inauthentic. And by the time I stood up to have my bar mitzvah, I was absolutely, I despised it. I just felt like I was being completely false to myself and standing up in front of people and saying things that I didn't believe. Now looking back, I realized that part of this was that I was being false about God, but I didn't even think about that at the time. I just realized I was being completely untrue to myself. And at the time, the area I grew up in was this kind of nouveau riche area. It was the area where the sons and daughters of immigrants came after they made it and built businesses. And when you were bar mitzvah, they gave you all kinds of jewelry. Boys would wear name bracelets and watches and gold chains and rings and things. And as you can see, I've never worn a lot of jewelry.
You have 3 gold chains
underneath. Yeah, I've been happily, devotedly married for almost 30 years, and I've never worn a ring. I just don't like the feel of it. But I did like having all this jewelry. I was 13 years old, and I felt like I was a wealthy man. I put it in a beautiful leather box, and I would kind of admire it from time to time. And over the course of months, maybe a year, it just turned very, very sour to me. I began to think, this is terrible. I've earned this money by standing up and lying and being completely inauthentic. And I waited one night until everyone had gone to bed, and I crept downstairs, and we had outside we had these garbage cans built into the ground where we would leave the kitchen garbage, and I stuffed the leather box with all these thousands and thousands of dollars worth of jewelry into this trash. And I can remember to this day, every time I tell this story, I can feel on my arm the feel of the eggshells and the coffee grounds creeping up my arm as I shoved it down there. But I didn't want anybody to find it before the garbage men came in the morning and took it away. And so that was, for me, a very deep statement of the way I felt about religion in general, because it wasn't Judaism in particular. It was just this falsehood, this inauthenticity that I didn't see.
And just in case the garbage men have been on strike for the past 40 years, what street was that?
Right, what a terrible mistake that was. I wish I had it.
So, religion generally seen as inauthentic, and then you head off to University of California, Berkeley, right?
Yeah, Berkeley, right.
So, 3,000 miles away, a deliberate
if the country had continued another 3,000 miles, I would be there. If I could have spoken Japanese, I was trying very hard to get away from home and get away from that life that I'd grown up in. And also, it was the end of the 60s, but I didn't really realize that. A lot of people in Berkeley still haven't realized that. But I was hoping to see some riots and some action. And in fact, I dropped out of school after my first year and got a job as a radio reporter, and ended up at 19 covering the Patty Hearst kidnapping. So that was a very exciting experience, but I didn't get to do a lot of radicalism, unfortunately.
And then you went back to school, or?
And then I did go back to school, and I finished in another 2 years, going through summers.
Okay, and so what was college life like in those days, as compared to, just so the students here have a basis of contact?
Well, I kind of wasted my college years. I drank as much as I possibly could, and chased as many women as I could get close to, which wasn't that many. And because I could write well, I was able to fake my way through classes. I rarely read any of the books. In fact, I once wrote an essay on William Blake, his Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which is now one of my favorite poems, but at the time I didn't know whether it was a poem or an engraving, because Blake was also an engraver. And I had to write this entire essay without knowing what kind of work it was. I used to think, like, well, a work, if you could call it a work, And I got a B- on it, so I was very, capable of faking my way through school. But all the while, for reasons that I didn't know at the time, I bought the books. I always bought the books, so I had the entire curriculum of books. And when I got out of school, and when it came to me that I had thrown away this very precious thing, my education, I stacked the books next to my chair, and I read every one of them and gave myself an education. And it wasn't a total waste, because at one point I was walking back to my car, and I saw an absolutely beautiful hitchhiker, and I thought, I've got to get my car, And I went running up to get my car, which had never before started on the first try. It started up, and then I came out and had to go around a one-way grid. And I actually almost killed an old woman cutting off the sidewalk trying to get to this hitchhiker. She was so beautiful, I figured someone was going to pick her up right away. And then I pulled up and sort of casually said, "You're going my way, my dear." I abducted her and haven't let her go for 30 years, and forced her to bear my children. So let that be a lesson to all of you.
And then you became a newspaper reporter, right?
Yes, I loved being a newspaper reporter. I was before there was USA Today, Gannett's big paper was called the Reporter Dispatch, and it was up in Westchester County, Westchester and Rockland. But it had one little tiny office in Putnam County, which at the time was what we call an exurb, which was really the country. And the office was about the size of this front place where we're sitting. It leaked when it rained. It was filled. We all smoked cigarettes, and we would type on these IBM Selectrics, and then send our stories down to the main office in what I thought was called an FACTS machine. I thought, because you sent the facts down on this thing. Actually, the first fax, and it was this enormous brass drum that would grind for, it would take 45 minutes to send anything. It was just you had to write on special paper to use it. But I was working with two guys, one of whom is now the chief political reporter of the New York Times, Adam McGurney. And the other is a guy named E.J. McMahon, who's now very prominent at the Manhattan Institute. So it was a talented crew, and it was exciting.
And how long did you do that?
I was there as a stringer at first, and then it was about a year. But in that time, I covered murders, and I was in car chases, and I was threatened by mobsters. I had as much fun as a boy could possibly have.
And so a good job out of college.
It was a great job.
Yeah. Still in business, that paper?
I think it is still there, but all the energy went into USA Today. While I was there, they came in and said, "We're starting a national newspaper. Anybody who wants to apply for a job should apply." And I thought, a national newspaper, that'll never work, because how would you get any ad revenue? So that was my far-seeing vision.
And then a script reader, like Columbia Pictures?
A script reader, yes. That was an act of desperation. I published, while I was at the Reporter Dispatch, I published my first novel. And I thought, I'm in, I'm made, I've done it, And so I quit my job at the paper, though I loved it, because I thought, now I'm a novelist.
Okay.
And the novel disappeared without a trace, and I couldn't get into print again for 5 years. And we were literally eating spaghetti every night and living, our refrigerator had cardboard boxes inside because we couldn't afford shelves, it was just awful. And then my wife spoke the two most inspiring words in the English language. I'm pregnant. And I thought, oh, I've got to make a living here, you know. And so I got a job, really by providence, I got a job at Columbia Pictures. We had the baby about a month after I landed the job, and the insurance paid for the entire thing. And it was, Columbia Pictures was owned by Coca-Cola, and I've never stopped drinking Coke ever since, you know. That was the most wonderful thing in the world. So yeah, that job was, it's a great job, because all you do is you read a book a day and tell them, and write a report telling, so they can pretend they've read it. That's what you do. Your job is to outline the book so that the studio executive can say, oh yeah, I read that, it's no good, I don't want that. You know? And you learn to do it in about 2 hours. Plus, I had a lot of friends who were doing the same thing, and we'd share our reports, and so sometimes it took an hour. So I'd write, you know, I'd use it to write all day long.
And those jobs still exist in some form, right?
Yeah, I mean, in LA, they're union jobs, so they're much tougher to get, and a lot of the movie business left in New York. That was one of the last jobs, and they finally found it on a budget line and fired me. I said, what are we paying this guy?
Okay. And then WOR?
Right.
ABC, news writer for radio?
I became a radio news writer
How
after that.
did you get that job?
Well, my father was a DJ, and so I had contacts, and he was a very famous New York DJ, and I had a lot of contacts in radio, and I went and did a writing test, and I was actually quite good as a radio writer. You have to be able to write, 15-second stories that encapsulate the national budget, and write them in 30 seconds. And I actually had a knack for that. And so I did it freelance. It was shift work. They would hire you for 7 hours at a time. And usually you had to work at about 3 o'clock in the morning. You had to go to work at 3 o'clock in the morning in Times Square mostly, which was where WOR was. So it was exhausting. I would go at 3 in the morning. I'd come home at 11. I'd play with my baby daughter by then, for half an hour sometimes, and then I'd go off and write. So I could keep my writing alive that way, but it was a very long day.
But you were able to keep your writing alive?
Yes, but it was quite difficult.
Let's say some of these folks want to be novelists and so forth. No one's going to pay you at first.
No.
So you have to be doing something else unless you're independently wealthy.
Sure.
Right. And what led you to keep going? I mean, you had some success. You had a child.
Yeah, I always tell people, and maybe it's a depressing thing to say, but I always tell people who want to be writers, don't do it unless you have to. And I love my work. And as you said, I wake up Monday morning, I am thrilled to get back to work. But I'm also compelled to do it. I have to do it. And I don't know why I have to do it entirely, but it seems to be my calling. And if it weren't, it would be so much easier. I mean, I'm a bright guy. I could have gone to law school. I could have done a lot of things. It's a hard road in a lot of different ways. And so I was compelled, and I knew it was what I had to do. And the idea of giving up, I won't say it never occurred to me, because I took it, as I started out, I took some very hard knocks. But I never seriously entertained it. It would have been a kind of emotional suicide, and I wasn't really up for that.
And you find among other writers there's that sense of compulsion. You got to do it. You get the shakes if you're away from it for 24 hours, or
you do. One of the things I've never had a lot of writer friends, and the reason is that when you start out as writers, it's wonderful. You just sit around. I think about Wordsworth: "We poets in our youth begin in gladness, but it ends in misery and madness." And when you start out as a writer, all you talk about is the craft, and you talk about the art, and you talk about who's great and who's bad, and how the critics are ruining this, and how and there's all this passion for it. And then you reach a certain point where all you're talking about is contracts, and how, who's your agent, and can I call your agent, and how'd you get that contract, and why'd they give you that publicity? They didn't give that to me. And I hate that conversation. I don't like to have it when I'm up, and I don't like to have it when I'm down. And I really care as much today about the craft and the art of what I'm doing as I did as a kid. And that's the conversation I want to be having. So my friends tend to be people who feel like that about what they do.
Okay. So let's have that conversation, let's talk about the craft.
Okay.
Okay, did you develop certain ways of writing at that time, or certain methods or ways to get going on stuff that still stay with you, or do you learn over the years different types of processes of just getting it flowing?
I wrote my first novel when I was 14.
Okay.
And I was a big fan of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and Hemingway and all those guys. And I had read a wonderful book of Raymond Chandler's letters. And in it he said something like, I can't quote, but it was something like, you should spend 4 hours every day doing nothing else but writing. You could stand on your head, you can twiddle your thumbs, but as long as you don't do anything else but write. And I took that very seriously, and I started to do that, even as a 14-year-old kid, and all through college. And that became my discipline. And the major change that I made for the better was that before I had children, I would work at night, and I would sometimes work from midnight to 4 a.m., and I would work, and everything seemed brilliant. When you're writing at 4 a.m., man, you are great. And the problem is at 8 a.m., some little elves have come in and put this terrible garbage on the page while you were asleep. And what happened was, when I had a kid, really by accident, I suddenly had to wake up in the morning just to arrange our lives and go to work early in the morning. And it was a real discovery that was my high energy time, that was my high focus time. And so I've stuck with that ever since.
Okay, now when you're writing in the middle of the night, ABC News stuff,
Yeah.
so you come back, play with your child, and then you start writing. Were you able to go for 4 hours at that point?
I would. I mean, my eyes would be streaming tears, but I would, yeah. And yes, I refuse to accept. The only time I ever stopped writing was when I was a newspaperman, and that was because I loved being a newspaperman so much I couldn't go home. So I would just sit around talking with, like, Adam McGurney, and I would get in some argument and would last till 2 in the morning. And that was the only time I ever let it slide. But with this, it was a 7-hour shift. You had to leave. Union rules wouldn't let you work overtime. And that's why I stuck to it. It was not that interesting. I loved the people that I worked with. The job wasn't that interesting. But I stuck with it because working another 4 hours did not seem too much to ask to build this thing that I wanted.
So I'm going to ask one of the dumb questions that writers are asked. Well, where do you get your ideas? But your newspaper experience, did any of that contribute to, or?
I've used stuff I saw in newspapers. I was a crime reporter for the most part, so I saw a lot of interesting criminal stories, some of which still come back to me. I still use them as inspiration. But I've seen a lot of things since then, and I use that too, and all that feeds into it. Experience, when I was young, especially because of the influence of Hemingway, experience, with a capital E, I believe that's how you spell it, was all important to me. The reason I didn't want to go to college, the reason I dropped out of college, is because I wanted experience. I wanted raw experience. I once walked out of my apartment in college and just got on a Greyhound bus and went to the Mardi Gras just because I just wanted, I wanted to be everywhere. I wanted to do, and over time, thought has become a lot more important to me, and imagination. And those are the things I tap into a lot more. I mean, I'm much more likely to sort of build a story out of a what-if question, or even build a story out of a philosophical discourse I'm having with myself about some esoteric subject that I think, gee, I could turn that into a really interesting story.
So these days more you start with a particular idea, and then start thinking about the human interest, the specific detail, as opposed to earlier, did you start with a particular episode and then develop this? Well, let me ask. I'm jumping ahead, I suppose, a little bit over time, but let me just ask early on. You're doing your 4 hours a day on what, an IBM Selectric or something like that?
I was worse. I started with a pen. I wrote with a fountain pen, and then I typed it up when I was all done. And it was grueling, I would get my fingers all gnarled and all that stuff. And then when they invented the computer, at first I wasn't interested. I thought, what's this new gizmo? And then when I became a radio news writer, they trained me on it. I literally left the office, emptied out my bank account, which had, I believe, $1,200 in it, and bought a leading edge computer, one of the very first computers. And I brought this home and I said to my wife, honey, we're broke, but this thing is going to pay us back. And she was always, as she has always been, she's okay, you know, and it did. It was,
I remember Leading Edge.
yeah, Leading Edge was great.
Yeah.
But I started out writing with a pen.
Okay, started with a pen, and did it, when you moved from pen to typewriter to Leading Edge, did that change the process at all? Or?
You know, I never used the typewriter because my
Okay.
process has always been to rewrite extensively as I
Gotcha.
go along, and the computer did that.
Right.
It imitated the pen more than the typewriter.
Okay, and did you start out then with a particular character in mind, a plot in mind, an idea in mind? Now you're saying you proceed from ideas. When you started out,
When I made, I started out, I thought I should be a literary writer, even
Right.
though all my skill and all my desire was always in the crime and mystery field. And so I would start out with an idea, and it would usually be some kind of juxtaposition of two kinds of things, and I was interested in the art of storytelling and the meaning of storytelling. When I first started writing thrillers, when I first sort of freed myself to write thrillers, which happened when I read this book, The Woman in White, and saw how rich and deep this form could be. I remember my daughter was still little, and I would check on her at night, and I remember walking across the living room to look in and check, make sure she was still breathing, you know, which I did till she was about 17. And I remember walking across the room and thinking, what if I looked in there and she was gone? And that was the kind of idea that I could work with forever. I mean, I could just sit there and think, yeah, that's pretty cool. What if you walked in to look where, you know, and then I would work that out. And I always reached a point with all my stories where I thought, what does this mean? What am I talking about? What's the story? And then that always enriched it.
and you're an atheist at this time, in essence, or
I was, yeah.
But you're still asking these questions of meaning.
Yes, because I was an atheist, but I was very involved in the postmodern kind of structuralist Freudian ideas of life, and where was truth, and truth was always, I was real, you know, anything relativistic I liked it, you know, it kind of interested me, I thought it made good art, which turned out to be untrue. But it did create interesting dilemmas for some of my characters, and a lot of my stories, I went through a cycle that took me many years where I started writing this story about a psychiatrist who analyzes a woman's delusion, but it turns out that the delusion is utterly true. And I was playing with the idea of the ways that our theories are constantly outstripped by life. And that went around in a large cycle until I came back to another book called Man and Wife, which was almost about the same. It was about a psychiatrist dealing with a delusive guy whose ideas about God might be true. And so I had kind of traced that idea back, and I had sort of outstripped the problems of relativism. I think is interesting.
And so the prejudices of the academy, in a sense, would say, well, this hard-boiled detective fiction is just wham bam, that's all there is, basically. But you're actually proceeding in a very different way. You're writing books with lots of action and adventure, but based on particular philosophical ideas, right? Is that...
At the risk of pomposity, which I generally don't like, I mean, I consider myself an artist. I really feel, a lot of people think that a thriller writer can't be an artist, and most of them aren't. And most of them, it's not their intention. I am. I think in America, so often, art grows up in the places where the critics and intellectuals aren't looking. John Ford being an artist who makes cowboy movies, and Stephen Sondheim being an artist who writes musical comedies. Sometimes in video games, which I really enjoy, you'll see artwork that is spectacular and far, to me, outstrips what I consider the con game of abstraction. And so again and again in America, it's people working away from the stream, with the mainstream of academic and critical thought, which tends to be very conformist. It tends in America to be very lockstep, and there are certain ideas that are unacceptable. God, I think, being maybe prime among them. When you start to talk about God in America, in intellectual America, you've gone over to the dark side. And I think that in the forms that are generally not respected as much, you're free to kind of follow the ideas of and your imagination where they go.
And where was your imagination going at this point as you thought about some of these big questions of meaning?
Well, what happened, interestingly, I mean, as I would come to the problems of my life, and we all have problems in our life, I would find various different methods to solve them, and they all worked. This was one of the most interesting things about my spiritual progression, is when I had psychological problems, I went to a psychiatrist and he cured me. I mean, it was wonderful. I'm the only person I know who was cured by I'm like an Onion headline, psychiatrist cures patient. And when I had spiritual, discomfort, I took up Zen meditation. It was wonderful. I'd recommend it to anybody who did it. And as I say, my marriage has been, really a remarkable marriage. I mean, it's not just a good marriage. My wife and I are very conscious of how blessed we are to have found each other. It is just not that many people who are still chasing each other around the room 30 years on. And I love my work. So I thought, gee, everything is great, except it's not. It's just not. And as I would continue, as I would continually keep coming back and back to this broken place and keep solving these problems, I realized that the broken place was essential, that it wasn't coincidental, it was existential. And that was when I began to think, well, maybe this point that I'd gotten to, which was the point of believing in the nobility of unknowing, the burden of unknowing, was not satisfactory and was not in keeping with what I was discovering in my work, because work is always a conversation with yourself. And in keeping with the way my life has worked, I was reading a novel by the guy I think is probably the best English novelist of the last part of the 20th century, and Patrick O'Brian, who writes sea adventures that take place in the Napoleonic Wars. And I was reading it in bed, and I got to a scene where one of the main characters, this kind of intellectual, strange guy named Maturin, he's a Catholic, and he's about to go to sleep, and he said a little prayer before going to sleep. And I thought, that's the one thing I've actually never tried. And so I said a very brief prayer. Things were going wonderfully, and I said a very brief prayer of thanks. And it went off in me like a bomb. There's really no words to describe the kind of flat, mushroom cloud. I've always thought that it is a tribute to the generosity of God, that even such really a prideful, arrogant little prayer, in some senses, an experimental prayer would be answered. There would be such a quick answer.
And how was it answered?
It was answered by this sudden sense of living the joy of my joy, if I can put it that way. That I was joyful, but I wasn't living that joy. I wasn't experiencing that joy. And then suddenly, in just the simple act of saying thank you, there it was. And it was real and manifest and alive to me. And so being no fool, I kept doing that. I thought I'm onto a good thing, And these prayers got more and more extensive, and my life transformed into what I had always been seeking it to be, authentic.
So this is when?
This is really, let's see, it's now, what we're talking about now is now generally about 7, 8 years ago, maybe a little more.
Okay, and so at that point, and let me just mention a footnote, Patrick O'Brian, O''B''R''I''E''N, wonderful series, about 24 books in all maybe, set in the Napoleonic Wars. The first one I think has the title Master and Commander.
Yes, maybe two.
And just wonderful, terrific books, highly recommended. Like the testimony of two witnesses here. So we're kind of going back and forth. Okay, your process, you're still doing your 4 hours, except now on a computer.
Yes, except now, of course, the 4 hours have become 4 hours plus 8 of various other things.
Because you're actually making a living.
Yes, right. And
these are successful. You've had a couple of them made into movies,
right.
and so forth, and they sell well,
yeah,
and so forth. Okay, so that's happening. And so you have all this success in life, you have publishing success, you have a very good marriage, but until this point you're not really feeling the full joy.
Right. And I was not alive, and I was not authentic. I had not come to that point where I saw that that Garden of Eden moment when you realize there is a moral order, and in its face you are sore ashamed, you know, and that there is something broken in you. And just that. And at this point, by the way, this was during this period, at the period this began, I was in a peak in my career, but there did come a trough in my career after this, as I was making this transition and I had lost my way and realized I no longer knew what I thought.
The transition, being you're saying a spiritual transition?
It was a spiritual transition and a political transition at the same time, but at some point I just no longer knew what I did believe. But I was still praying, and I was praying, my prayers were getting longer and longer, and I was driving around the beautiful Santa Barbara Hills, kind of, you know, going through this experience. And I realized that I had suddenly become the person that I had wanted to be since I was a little kid. Merely in this act of connecting with some part of myself that I had not connected with, namely this other outside power. And when I realized this, I was filled with gratitude, and I sort of had this moment when I was like, dude, you know, this is a big thing that you have done in my life. How am I supposed to answer this? And that was the first moment where, out of the blue, the answer sort of came back to me that I should get baptized. And no one could have been more surprised than me. I mean, that was not the answer I was expecting. It created massive difficulties for me. My father and I had never been the closest of friends, but he was a man of integrity, and I hope I am too, and we had made a separate peace at that point after many difficult years. And that would have been the end of our relationship. As he had once told me, he once said to me, you know, if you ever convert, even though he didn't really believe in any of it, he said, if you ever convert, you know, I'll disown you.
But he was thinking for some reason that you were moving in that direction?
Well, it's another story, but it's a funny story. I mean, I started reading, I had come to the conclusion, which I still maintain today, that anybody who wanted to be educated had to read Shakespeare and the King James Bible. And so I set about doing this in my little determined teenage way. And one day my father walked into my room without knocking and caught me reading the Gospel according to St. Luke, which always makes me crack up when you think of what a teenage boy could be reading, which I was also reading. And he was absolutely furious. I mean, I was reading it for purely literary reasons, and it really was not having much of an effect on me. He was absolutely furious about it. And so he had said, you know, that I hope this is not the beginning of anything, because I was kind of like, you know, dazed by his wrath at that point.
But you had been warned.
I'd been warned, yes. But now at this point, he and I were very distant. We were on good terms, but very distant terms. And I could almost never write this into a novel because nobody would believe it. I mean, I came to the conclusion. I mean, I'm not a young man anymore. I came to the conclusion I had to do this thing. That this is clearly where I was. That I had accepted Christ. That the belief system that I had come to was a Christian belief system, and that in all integrity, I simply had to be baptized, simply to be publicly what I was. And I realized I would do whatever I had to do, you know. And at that point, my father and mother came to California for Christmas. They're in New York, and I'm in California at this point. And as I said, we weren't close.
You mean winter holiday?
Yes, the winter holiday. That's the solstice. And my father came by, and I'm kind of debating this with myself. I contacted an old friend of mine who was a priest and said in this babbling email that I must still have somewhere. You know, I don't know how to put this into words, but this thing has happened to me. You know? And my father came over, and as I was debating this, he complained of double vision. And he went back home, said, I'm going to have to go back to the doctor. And he went back home and he had a brain tumor. And it developed into something called multiple myeloma, which is usually a very, very slow-acting form of cancer. I believe it's a cancer. It is cancer. It's very slow moving, but this just rampaged through. So while I was coming back to visit him, I was coming back to visit this priest, who was my friend, who I wanted to baptize me. And so I would see my father, and at this point I knew I'm just not going to tell him, because it would just ruin the end of his life. I mean, it would be a disaster. And finally I came back, and that year, Passover and Holy Week fell on the same time, and it was, in fact, Passover and Holy Week. And I had said to my pal, the priest, would you baptize me? And he said, well, we don't usually do it during Lent. So I said, fine, we'll do it next time. And I went to visit my father, and I walked in, I took one look at him, and I realized he was dying. And it had happened while everybody was around him, and they hadn't noticed it. And in fact, his doctor, who by sheer weird coincidence was an old friend of mine from college, called me up and said, how's your dad doing? And I said, well, you're the one who got the medical degree, but I think he's dying, And that very day, he was taken into the hospital, and so through Holy Week, basically, he was dying. On the Thursday, he died. I went back and arrived home on Easter. I remember that Easter was kind of enveloped in this weirdly real golden light. I felt, it was this experience, not to be corny about it, but it was the experience of both losing and gaining a father. And then when I went back to his memorial, I virtually left his memorial service and walked over to be baptized. And to end that story on a happier note, I mean, the baptism, it was funny, when I was married, my wife and I had been together for 4 years when we finally decided to get married, and I was sort of thought, it's a ceremony, it makes no difference, whatever. And the minute the ceremony was over, I walked into the bathroom and I looked in the mirror and I thought, you just did the smartest thing you've ever done in your life. You just stumbled into doing this really important, smart thing. And I had just to show you, I hadn't learned anything in the interceding 25 years. I had the exact same experience with baptism. I thought this is a kind of rite of passage that I have to go through to be honest about who I am. But I didn't even take my wife. I just did it privately. I said, I'll come in and have your family witness this, and I'll do it privately, and I did. And of course, the minute I stood up from the altar rail, I thought exactly the same thing. I just made one of the smartest decisions in my life. It was hugely important, and it has been ever since.
And where's your wife in all this?
My wife, it was interesting. My wife was a kind of like, I'd like to believe, but I'm not quite there kind of person. And then she had a very emotional experience when her mother died. She died in her arms, and she came back and said, I know that there was someone there and that she went elsewhere. And she was very much taken with that. And so she followed me into church a little bit more reluctantly, started like, I don't want to be saying the Nicene Creed and all that stuff. And, it's all her, whatever she wants, but she has become much more into it, and she had been baptized at 15.
And how does this affect your writing?
Well, that is a great question, because the biggest fear I had before converting, all the issues I wrestled with, the issue especially of not wanting to seem that I had turned my back on Jews or had been trying to be accepted by anybody or anything like that. That was a big issue. But the biggest fear I had was that I would lose my sense of reality. That I would start writing books about, children who lost their puppies and Jesus brought them back,
It's a very well-popular genre.
I was afraid that I would become moralistic and, that I'd clean up, wouldn't let my characters say the things that they would naturally say. And that I would just lose my realism, which has been very important to me all my life. And the fascinating thing is it has turned me into a far, far more I think, far better observer of the human condition. It is now that I've gotten rid of the Freudianism and the silly, what I think now is silliness, I think that I understand people in a much more immediate and visceral way, and it shows in my writing. And so I think it's been a very positive thing. I don't write, explicitly Christian works, but there is now a much more openly spiritual element to them. But that's part of people's lives, and I think it's made me more of a realist.
Let's go to some questions. I suspect you have lots of them, and I may occasionally intersperse some. But, who will lead the army? Who will start the Yes.
I was curious as to what keeps you interested in each individual piece that you actually write. I know one of the things that I struggle with a lot of times is I'll have an idea start writing it, have another idea, get distracted with that, put the other one aside, and keep writing over and over again.
Right.
So I'm just curious, what is it that keeps you connected with each piece, that you finish the whole piece?
Well, first of all, I let them develop before I start writing them, until I'm sure that I'm really interested in them, until I'm sure that the themes really are going to be rich and interesting, the characters rich and interesting. I do a lot of prep work, a lot of outlining, which I hate, by the way. I do a lot of figuring out how things are going to go, because thrillers are kind of like sonnets. They're very constrained in what you can, in the amount of space you have to do what you want to do. And so you have to know where the beats are going to be. So I do a lot of preparatory work. That said, there always comes a moment in everything I write when the premise has been set up, and the thing that originally grabbed me, the thing that I was walking down the street that struck me, in the forehead, and I thought, gee, that's a good idea, has been played out, and you now have to go down the other side of the mountain, and it always is a sort of a mid-book malaise that you just learn is coming, and you work your way through it. On the novel I just finished a first draft of it. When I reached that point, I realized that I wasn't interested in the rest of the book as I had it planned out. And so I did put it aside for many months, for about 4 or 5 months, until I had a second half that expressed the things that I thought were inherent in the first. And that's something also I've learned to do over time, because in the old days I would have pushed through and probably done damage to the book. But I know I've done a lot of prep work before I start writing. The writing's the fun part, You've got to be careful about that. And I do a lot of prep work before I start writing, so I know that it has places that I want to go and scenes that I want to write.
If you could recommend one book that you'd say carry it around with you for a couple of years, read it, reread it, besides the Bible.
That would not be the book I like.
Just what would you?
Well, I would recommend the complete works of Shakespeare. I mean, that would be one thing I would recommend. The book that has been incredibly important to me, doing what I do and also being who I am, has been Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And I just recently read that, found it to have been, I read it when I was 19, and then I reread it again a couple of years ago and found it to have been a virtual roadmap of my spiritual and intellectual life. It's basically been like a seed that had been planted and had grown into. But I have to tell you that I always worry when people ask me this question. And the reason is this, that you're working in one of the great traditions on earth. The novel in English is, I would maintain, as great as any art form has ever been, and still has some gas left in it. You should know what that tradition is, and you won't know by reading one book. You should read that tradition. There's, I don't want to, you could almost get 100 great books, book and go through them. But you should never feel that there is some book of instruction or some one book that is going to teach you how to do this. They all teach you how to do it. And by the time I felt I was really good at what I was doing, I had read virtually everything that I would consider great in the Western tradition. There may be one or two outliers that I haven't hit, but and so I would educate yourself. I mean, if you want to be like an artist, you have to know. You have to know what you're doing, and I think those are the tools we have. So, probably not the answer you wanted.
No, yeah, that's great. Thanks.
How does the publishing process affect your, your writing? Because it always seems to me like you have the writing, you do that, but then there's really almost this totally separate process with the publishing. Do they affect each other, and really how does that go about?
It depends on the choices you make. I mean, I made the choice that I was going to write what I wanted to write, and then find the publishers for it. And that's a harder, slightly harder, not slightly, a harder road to go down. There are plenty of enormously successful writers who look at the marketplace and see what it's doing, and then query the publisher and say, I've got an idea, and here's the first chapter, and here's the rest of the plot. And, they query an agent, not a publisher. And would you be interested in seeing more of this, and maybe getting the contract even before they write it? There's a very successful, probably one of the most successful writers alive, named James Patterson, who I can't finish the first chapter of one of his books, but he basically has a blithe, he's an old ad man. He used to work in the advertising business. And he basically has a point-by-point process on how to create these things. And so you can do that too. Your relationship with your publisher is something for you to choose. All they want is to sell books. Now they also want to sell good books. There's some publishers who want to sell good books. So, you have to do what you know and love how to do, and then go to the publisher if I think you're going to write your best stuff. That's what I think. But there is a commercial approach to it too. Does that answer?
Well, I guess to further that, since that's the route you take, how do you go about finding publishers who are truly interested in just taking your work for it?
You should never find a publisher. You should find an agent. And the way you do that is you read the books that you think have some relation to what you're doing. And it may be a distant connection, but they remind you somehow of what you're doing. And then you find out who their agents are, which you can usually do by reading the acknowledgments, because usually they thank their agent. If you can't do it that way, you can get something called the literary marketplace or writer's market or something, and then just track down who the agents are. You can call the publisher, sub-rights department, and find out. And then you go to those agents with a letter and just send them a letter, 3 paragraphs long, that says, my name is this, I've written a book about this, my credits are this, if you have any credits, and would you like to see the first 10 pages, or would you like to see, the agent will find your publisher. The agent has lunch with publishers, knows publishers. If you go to a publisher first, you will only get cheated and abused. But an agent will protect you. They're still very important.
How long have you had your current agent?
It's been about 7 years or so. I've gone through a lot of agents because many of them are not very good, and also because I went through a tremendous change. At one point, I actually left a very good agent because I knew he was no longer going to want to handle what I was doing.
What was that?
Because I was getting very politically conservative and very spiritual, and it was getting very in your face about some of it, and I knew he wasn't going to want to do it.
I wish my wife were here because she'll never believe that I play video games for the story, and so I was very inspired to hear you say that. Do you actually play video games, or do you talk with people about the storyline?
Oh, no, my friend. I am quite a gamer, but unfortunately, I have a teenage son. He's about to leave for college, but I would usually play with him, and he got to be so good at it that most of my role was getting killed and having him say, you
Someone's gonna do it.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of lost some of my edge for a while. I was really good. And I'm old enough so that I started out, I walked into a dormitory in college, and there was Pong. You know what Pong, and to me that was like that scene in 2001 when the Earth Stone rises up. And then as each new advance, when Space Invaders came out, I was at the newspaper, and me and E.J. McMahon, and for a while Adam, would go over and play this game where you press the button, and it was like if you can imagine a roll of quarters it's in quick motion time getting shorter and shorter. That's how we would play. And one day I woke up and I had this bump on my wrist, and I thought, oh my, this is terrible. I went to a doctor and he says, have you been making any repeated pressing motions? So help me. I go home and open the Sunday magazine, and there's a thing called Space Invaders Wrist, which is now spreading through the country. So I've hit every beat, and when they first got to the point where they really had good graphics, because I went away from them, I'd go away from them, I'd get bored with whatever generation they were in, and I'd stop. When I first picked up games like Doom, they first had graphics, that was the end for me. Then they were telling stories, and it was immersive, and I loved it. I've played a lot of the great ones. My favorite is still a game called Ico. Do you know Ico?
I played I couldn't even figure out how to get past the first level. There was like a ladder. I had no idea what to do. It's beautiful, though.
It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
I want to just read couple of sentences from a novel, Damnation Street, which depicts Christians in the hostile territory of the University of California, Berkeley. So you do that. Although this is set in more recent times. But there are some Christians who are meeting privately and quietly for worship in an unmarked house, just off campus. And the narrator is a guy who's kind of a gumshoe in training,
Right.
and he's trailing a young lady of whom he's become very fond, and he wants to find out. She's been dodging him for a while. He wants to find out what she's up to. What has she become? Something strange has happened. So he's peeking in. He peeks in from a back window, and he sees them singing hymns, I believe, and he's shocked. And then he watches them, and he says, "They were praying. They were Christians. Emma too." Emma's his would-be girlfriend. Emma was a Christian. I could not have been more shocked if I looked in and seen her. There's an expletive here that I will delete. What was she thinking? How could she possibly be a Christian? So, that's the reaction I suspect that you get from some people. Is that the typical reaction out in your?
I frequently, yes, you get it. Now the people I know, or the people I still know, are open-hearted at least. But I frequently get this kind of, that it's this odd thing about me. And but for the rest, for the people whom I used to know, who I will no longer hire me or talk to me, there is this sense that you've gone over to some kind of dark cult of weirdness. There's this tremendous idea. This is our idea, especially in American intellectual circles, that religion is violating the spirit of the Enlightenment. And they say this quite openly, that you're violating the spirit of the Enlightenment, by which they obviously mean the French Enlightenment, which they forget was a terrible disaster. The ideas of the French Enlightenment led to terror and world war and tyranny, And so you think like, well, yes, I am. That's exactly what I am doing. If that's the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment is scientific thought, no, I'm not. I believe very deeply in scientific thought, and so there's a whole other strain of intellection that has been healthy and bright and wonderful, that flowed through the British Romantics and adapted some of the ideas of the Enlightenment to more sensible things that formed our idea of a creator endowing you with life, liberty, and with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's the tradition I'm in. I'm not at some kind of, I'm not wandering in the desert with an idea that no one has ever thought of before. I've simply joined, I think, a far healthier, far more productive, and far more liberty-oriented tradition of Western thought.
We're trying to teach students here to engage our culture, get out of the holy huddle, and in the process, of course, a lot of folks will find that they are being, as they say in the 19th century, cut by their former associates and so forth. So I'm just wondering how you deal with that. Do you have a certain hard shell, or?
This has been another. I was never a fearful or anxious person, but really since finding Christ, I have become bizarrely fearless about things like this. I'm not fearless about falling off a log in the middle of the Amazon, but this I'm not worried about it at all. I get called terrible names, and in public. And my poor publisher the other day, I got reviewed. It's just a savage, review. That in fact, I've received savage reviews that I agreed with. This was a savage review I in no way deserved. And my poor publisher, they were shattered. And I said, woe unto you when all men speak well of you. That really is the way I feel. And weirdly, because of that attitude, I find that there are not many people of goodwill who cut me that much. It really is these people who feel that, if you disagree with them in any way, and there are plenty of them, especially in Hollywood, if you disagree with them in any way, you're a bad guy somehow. And there are plenty of those out in Hollywood, and they really don't want to talk to me anymore anyway. But people of goodwill, I find, are far more tolerant. The less afraid of them I am, the more tolerant of me they are.
Some more questions?
Who do you imagine reading your books? Do you have a certain readership in mind when you write, or do you do it for yourself? Or
Well, when I write, I don't think of a readership. I really am trying to get at something that I want on a page, and it's in my mind and my heart that I'm trying to put down. I always imagined that I was a very, a kind of guy's writer. That I say things that guys don't usually say openly to girls, but say to other guys. And so I do get letters from women sometimes, kind of shaking their fingers, but I also get these letters from guys that say like, thank you, nobody. I was afraid to say that, But more and more, I find that there is a group of people who are. A friend of mine actually once called them South Park conservatives. They're people who are engaged in the culture. They're not afraid of the culture, but they get that the culture is in error in general. And suddenly they see somebody who's sort of just saying it, just kind of not mincing words about it, but just saying, no, this is wrong. And it's wrong, and it also is taking us down a garden path and all this stuff. And so I get a lot of those readers. Who they are exactly, I have no idea. I have no way of knowing. But I get letters from all over the place, and they seem pretty different.
Now you've become pretty active politically,
I have.
and do you enjoy that? And how is that type of writing that you're doing, increasingly in speaking, different from your novel writing? Are there different parts of your brain, or?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's very different, and I feel much more. I feel very responsible. You don't want to get a fact wrong. You don't want to attack anybody who didn't say what you said they said. And it's journalism. It's going back to my journalistic roots in that sense. There are times when I get into the scrap of it, and I enjoy the scrap. I enjoy the fight. I've always thought of myself as a storyteller. I've always thought of myself as a guy who just spins tales that people want to hear. I'm in this fight because I felt called to it, in the sense that it really became a big deal when Hollywood started making movies about our troops that were attacking our troops while they were in the field. Which I have no problem with, people being against the war. I have no problem with that. But it did seem a large leap from being against the war to America's an evil country and our troops are baby killing, which they made about 12 movies of, all of which bombed, and yet they kept making them. And not one movie, not one, that said, we're under attack, we're under threat, Islamofascism is bad, some ideas are good, freedom, good, Islamofascism, not so good, not such a good idea. Guys who fight this dangerous thing, heroes, people who, fight for this bad idea, bad guys, not one movie saying that. And so that really, I found appalling. And I felt that as long as people were out there getting shot to protect me from these people, I owed it to them, really. It seemed like nothing to write op-eds in the LA Times that made people, write me emails wishing I would die. It didn't seem like such a big deal. And that kind of burgeoned into this whole thing. I wound up going to Afghanistan to be embedded with the soldiers just so I could speak with authority about it. And now people are asking me to speak, and I'm going different places. And I enjoy it. I enjoy meeting the people. I enjoy getting out of my room. Writing is a very lonely profession. But there are times when I sort of feel that I wish I could sort of return to my little room and just turn off the phone and do what I do. And I hope there'll come a time when that happens.
What was the most gripping part of your Afghan experience?
I went out on a mission with the troops. It was about 3 days, and I was so taken with their expertise, their humanity, their hilarity. They're hilariously fun. Like most people who do very dangerous things, they're hilariously funny. And we were sitting in this compound, which was like these aluminum buildings, with hills all around us. And there was one guy who was in charge of the top sergeant. They called him Top. He was in charge of the security. And I was doing interviews, about it. And I walked up to him and I said, Top, but how do you protect a place like this? I mean, we could be shelled, you set a mortar up there that just blow us all away. How do you protect this? And he said, well, if we are attacked, we will depend on American might and American will to send them to their untimely demise. And I said, so it's indefensible. He said, yeah. And I was just really impressed with that kind of attitude that was pervasive and throughout. And I really was moved by the whole thing.
This was an article you wrote about it in City Journal, and there's a major who had told you when you were in California, I guess, that it's pretty safe in Afghanistan, and you're more likely to get hit by a bus in Santa Monica than for anything dire to happen to you there. And then he calls you, right, and says he's been ambushed.
As I'm ready to fly from Kuwait to
right.
Bagram, yeah.
Right, and so you asked in this article, okay, what the hell happened to I'm more likely to get hit by a bus in Santa Monica? I shuddered to Rory over the phone. Quote, I am more likely to get hit by a bus in Santa Monica, he answered. Unfortunately, I'm more likely to get hit by a rocket in Afghanistan. So humor.
Yeah, and he was a funny guy because he was a showbiz guy. They called him Hawkeye because he talked exactly like Alan Alda in MASH. Just exactly, it was unbelievable. And he looked a little like him, but he talked exactly like him. And he was in showbiz. He did a lot of consulting for films that were about the military. And so he had this kind of showbiz sensibility, which I had a little bit of, and he was constantly, I would be thinking things, and he would constantly say them at the moment I was thinking them. It was just, I was thinking kind of Hollywood thoughts. And one of them was, I thought to myself, you look at these guys, and if you watched a 1950s patriotic movie about World War II, you would get a more honest depiction of what our soldiers are like than if you watched a theoretically more realistic modern movie made today. And just as I was thinking that, he came over and said that exact thing to me. And I just thought it was really true. I thought the old war movies, as much as they were sometimes filled with jingoism, sometimes filled with sentiment, did capture something about people who go to war and fight for their country that these movies simply don't understand. And one of the reasons they don't understand them, by the way, is because none of these guys have been there. Not one of them.
So Hollywood sometimes gets criticism for being overly commercial and so forth, but you'd think that, okay, if there have been 12 movies depicting American soldiers as baby killers at a bomb, you think there'd be an audience for one movie depicting what you saw.
Right.
So why aren't these guys who are very commercial just making a movie and are they more ideological than?
Yes, one of the things is this thing about in Hollywood they just want to make money, which I hear almost every day, is one of those things that sounds cynical and wise, but in fact happens to be untrue. Mm-hmm. Of course, they do want to make money, but the way the system has developed over the years since the fall of the studio system, they make money from so many different sources that movies really lose money, especially these small independent movies. So you make them, there are plenty of people in France who want to go and see us look like idiots. So they'll make their money back in DVDs and foreign sales and all this stuff. But they could make a lot more money making a popular movie. And they don't do it because of ideology. And because they're afraid of the foreign opinion, and because they're afraid of the reviews. The reviews would be savage, and they don't want those reviews. So they're controlled by an they're in an ideological trap. They want respect. They want awards. You won't win the awards that way. And they want love and respect, and to be called artists, and to be hailed, and all those things you get by attacking America, basically.
So who's going to make the great movie about Iraq or Afghanistan?
Good question. Right now there is kind of an underground movement of people who feel the way I feel coming together. It's kind of pitiful. They meet in secret. They really do. They meet in secret. And they almost. And it's like an AA meeting. They confess. Like, yes, I too love my country. Love liberty. I too, love. And it really is like that. Where meanwhile, the other side is kind of making anti-American remarks in business meetings. So you go in to sell your material, and they start telling you what a terrible, racist country this is. And you realize that idea you had about the heroic soldier going to Afghanistan is not going to sell, And so it is happening. I think think they've gone too far. I think they've pushed us too far. People are starting to get angry. They're starting to be willing to risk their careers. My career is basically over out there because of this. And I think there are other people, not even who aren't quite as ornery as I am, who are ready to come out and state their case. And hopefully the money will come. They really have pushed this beyond the edge. Everybody knows what's going on. My buddy Andrew Breitbart, who created the Drudge Report, has this new site called Big Hollywood, where we've all been calling them out. And I think it's happening. I'm very hopeful about it, actually.
I'm curious, just as I hear you talk about your life and decisions and even this Afghanistan thing, more about your wife, and just what a fascinating woman she must be to kind of go alongside you through all this. Can you just talk about her and your dynamics and what she does maybe and how she comes alongside this?
She's an amazing woman. She never wanted to be anything but really a wife and mother to begin with. And as I said, we've had a remarkable time together. Now my son's about to go to college, so she went back to school and she became a psychotherapist, which I think living with me has trained her for extensively. She has been remarkable in her devotion and in her kindness to me and in her incredible patience. We literally have had one fight, which happened when I was working at the radio station. I was so exhausted, that I kind of became surly, and so many elements went into that fight that were outside ourselves. It just and really, I always, people say, what's the secret of a good marriage? I always say, marry Ellen. She, for instance, when I went to Afghanistan, she said to me, I'm going to handle this by denial. And I said, okay, whatever you say here, and I went off to Afghanistan and I'd call her and say, hi, how are you? It's good to hear from you. How's everything? Oh, good. I'm outside the wire now. Oh, well, that's nice. And then I came home, and of course it's around the world, so you're dazed for several days. And I sat down to watch a basketball game, and I fell asleep. And she comes in, and I wake up, and she's shaking me like this. And I said, what? And she said, I thought you were dead. and so denial had its kind of played, it came back to her and backed up on her. But she really has been like that. She has been an incredible mother. I mean, she is, her children rise up and call her blessed that they adore. When her mother died, I was speaking before about her mother died, which was this tremendous experience. She comes from a very fractious family. Her father was a great genius, a wonderful novelist named Thomas Flanagan. And my son has inherited his mind and has this great genius mind. But they were a very fractious family. I always refer to, probably guys are too young to know the Munsters, the TV show The Munsters, but I always refer to her as the blonde girl in the Munsters, because she was the normal. And I think she was just very committed to a certain kind of life that, I say this at my peril, but I will say it, that we got married really at the height of feminism, when feminism was and we kind of looked at each other and we said, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. This is not the life we want to live, and it's not a life I would have lived, frankly, And she was, I'll never forget this moment when we were having a dinner party, and a woman turned to her and right rudely, I think, said to her, in anger, out of nowhere, she said, you treat him like a king. You cook for him. You clean up for him. What does he do? And she went, she said, he did all this, like the house and these children who were well behaved and this life we have, And I was so moved that she had noticed, and what was so interesting was the woman who said it to her was likewise the beneficiary of her husband and hadn't noticed, And so she really, made a man of me, and I was very grateful for that. And and it really has worked out so that it's a fascinating thing, because people who have no spiritual life think everything is about power. They think everything is about who's got the power, but it's just completely untrue. It's completely untrue. She has immense power. People would look and say, well, you get to come home and sort of play the, yes, but her happiness is everything to me. It is the direction of my life, so that it's a very well balanced thing. It's just not, we're not the same, and I think that she understood that long before I did, and she lived her life out like that. And because she was who she was, I realized any time when I was kind of disgruntled, it was my fault, and I would fix whatever was going on. And it's just been a remarkable thing. I don't know what else I can tell you.
Two of your books have been made into movies. Did you like the movies?
I try never to. There's always this wonderful story about James M. Cain, one of the great American crime writers, a terrific American crime, and all his books were made into movies. And an interviewer once said, "What do you think about what Hollywood did to your books?" And he said, "Hollywood has done nothing to my books. They're right over there on the shelf." And I always try and take that attitude. One book that I wrote under a pseudonym named Mrs. White was made into an absolutely terrible film called White of the Eye. Then True Crime was made by Clint Eastwood, and he's a great director. He has made some great films. This wasn't one of them. And the reason it wasn't one of them was very simple. The guy in the book is a 35-year-old womanizer, and he played it, and he was in his 70s. And he would have these scenes romancing, 26-year-old women on the screen. And at the preview, I was sitting at the back, and I could literally see the women's shoulders going like this. And there was that, and I always hate to diss him because I love his movies so much, and I was so grateful that he made one and all this stuff. And he's an American classic as a filmmaker. But the other thing about it was he has this very slow, meditative style. And True Crime happened to be a book that was written in this very rapid, fast-paced style. And so the screenwriter said to me, it's as if they were passing around a football, and every time it gets to Clint, he holds on to it. Then they made Don't Say a Word with Michael Douglas, and that was fun. I liked that. That was the only thing they've ever done of mine where they filmed the text instead of the subtext. They always realize there's more to my books than meets the eye, and so they try and film more, and it doesn't work. They just kind of filmed that as a direct thriller, and it was a good film, entertaining. The best film I've ever been involved with was a film called Shock to the System, which is a novel by Simon Brett, and I wrote the screenplay, and Michael Caine is in it. And that's a good movie, and it holds up. And I have to say, when it came out, it kind of disappeared. It didn't do very well, and I only saw it. I was doing an interview, and the guy showed a clip of it on the screen, and I went, hey, that's actually pretty good, And then I went back, and it turns up in those books like, the 100 best movies you've never seen and stuff like that. And I like, that's the one movie I've been involved with that I was really pleased with, Shock to the System.
And how is writing a screenplay different from writing a novel?
It's more craftsmanlike. It's more like, it's the difference between being a carpenter and an architect. You write a novel, you're a mini god, you're making up this world, and everything. For a guy to walk across the room is a morning's work. You got to create the room, you got to create the walk, you got to create everything he thinks of, all his reactions. You're writing a screenplay, he walks across the room, and that's it. And so it's all structure. I mean, the screenplay is all structure. If you build the framework, the movie will work. When I first Shock to the System was the first film I ever wrote. And I worked on the character like a novelist. I created him, I got his backstory, and then I saw the rushes, I saw the dailies, Michael Caine walked on screen, and I thought, what was I thinking? It's Michael Caine, I didn't have to worry about it. He would take care of that.
Have you written or thought of writing any graphic novels?
Actually, I've never thought of doing it myself, but I've become interested in them recently. I hear this one, Sandman, is quite good. I just read Neil Gaiman's Coraline. And I'm more interested in looking at them. I can't say whether I would then become interested in doing them, but I hear that some of them are pretty fascinating.
What's the other questions? about life or craft.
I just covered everything. Is that?
Then I will seize this opportunity to ask another question. You wrote in the Washington Post back last August about why conservatives tend to be fairly silent. And you say the left has somehow succeeded in convincing the rest of us that there is virtue in a culture of lies, that some truths should not be spoken, and that if you speak them, you are guilty of racism or sexism or some other kind of bigotry. Right-wingers may disagree philosophically with this sort of political correctness, but I think they may have incorporated some of its twisted values psychologically and walk in fear of seeming offensive or insensitive. So when that's been internalized, it's much more difficult than if it's just external and so forth. So how do you begin getting at that? Or is this something that, you know, God's grace can do and humans can't?
You know, it is part of that when I was talking about that fearlessness, that's part of what I'm talking about. I mean, they have truly made it so that if you say, I mean, one of the reasons I left the country for 7 years, and one of the reasons I left the country was after I had a son, I was sitting at a dinner party, and I said, boy, boys are different than girls. And the dinner party shut down. Boom. You know, like that. I turned to my wife and said, we're leaving the country. You know? I'm not going to live like, where you can't say the most obvious, like, you know. And that's, you know, I keep hearing conservatives say things like, you know, I don't want to sound racist, but, you know. And I think, like, hey, wait a minute, you know, it's Democrats who made Detroit, liberals who made, you know, liberal policies that made Detroit. Never mind the parties, because I don't care about the parties. But it's liberal, leftist policies that made Detroit and that made, you know, all these, that made New Orleans and all these cities that have sunk into complete disarray. That's true racism, and is not caring about the outcomes as much as you care about how much goodness you seem to exude. And so I'm just will not apologize for feeling that we are responsible for ourselves, for feeling that liberty is more important than equality, for feeling that liberty is more important than just about anything, because there's nothing without liberty. Without, you have no virtue. You know, when I heard, I guess it was Joe Biden say, you know, it's patriotic to pay your taxes. It's nothing to do anything by force. You know, there's no virtue in what you do by force. Only the things you choose have virtue. And so I simply have stopped apologizing. And you do get called these names. It's unbelievable, the things they unleash on you. But I know, I have gone into my heart, I know, you know, I'm not a racist. I do believe the sexes are different, you know, sue me. You know, but really when I look at the broken families that have developed since I was a boy, when I've seen the cities that have been destroyed, when I've seen the black lives in neighborhoods that have been absolutely ravaged by policies that were meant with all good intentions, but were really meant to buy off guilt, I think. I'm not ashamed of what I believe in the least. I really want people to be free because I think it's everything. I think it's the meaning of life.
And are you finding, I mean, there are some other conservatives in Hollywood, I mean, perhaps just in the catacombs.
Yeah.
There are some other Christians in Hollywood, also sometimes in catacombs. Are they the same catacombs, different catacombs?
No, Christians have been much more successful in Hollywood, and for reasons that unfortunately aren't suitable to me, is they have found a kind of, it's that G-rated kind of sentimental version of religion, which the studios don't like, but it makes money, and so they kind of let it go by. It's the Mel Gibson, you know, South Park stuff that they can't tolerate. You know, it's funny. Mel Gibson is a dark character. There's no question about it. But you know, who ever heard of an artist with a dark side? You know, that's what a difference that is. You know, but what a genius filmmaker it is, and they almost killed him. You know, they really almost killed him. I've never seen. I always say that like Jesus in that movie got off easier than Mel Gibson. You know. And I think that's what a lot of these artists don't want to face. You know, they don't want to face that. Who wants to be called that? And they do it. They really do it every day. It's quite appalling.
So do you see some ways in which, if this sort of left leaning ideology has taken over the high ground, chiefly through the rhetoric, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they basically own the language. Orwell would have, turned over his grave, but
Yeah.
he's turning over his grave. How do we go back then? How do we recover it? Particularly for civil society, we've got the Limbaughs and the Hannitys sort of, railing because they're sick and tired as well. But just to get back to something of civil society that pushes back against the ideological and says, we have to exercise true tolerance here, because you all are a bunch of hypocrites
Right.
in not being tolerant. How do you get back there? How do you reclaim something of that?
Well, for me, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do is I feel like, I'm an artist, I have to make things, It's not enough for me to complain, though I do complain, but, you have to make things. So I've started, recently I wrote a book, a young adult novel, comes out next month for a religious publisher, and they had asked me, would I do a young adult thriller? And I said, look, I'm not preaching to anybody because it's obnoxious, it's anti-storytelling, I said, but I will change the rules of the game. All I'll do is have a hero who believes in God. That'll be the only thing. He's not going to preach to anybody. He's not going to, there aren't going to be any speeches, but that's going to be who he is. And they said, to my surprise, I thought they were going to send me home, but to my surprise, they said, no, do it. That's what we want. And they have been incredibly welcoming to that. And I'm trying to do that in everything I write. When I talk to Andrew Breitbart, I tell Breitbart and I sometimes sound like two kids in a college dorm smoking dope. We're kind of going like, yeah, man, that's just what I mean. Because we're both very passionate about this. He believes, I believe that you have to be bold. I believe that I'm just going to do it, and I'll take the heat. I just feel that I cannot do this in secret. I have to make things. They have to say what I see. They have to speak my soul. They have to be that thing that I'm saying should be out there. Breitbart feels that, yeah, that's okay, but while they're, nailing me to the wall, he also feels that, like, young people should come out to Hollywood, as he puts it, put the sign of Satan on their forehead, infiltrate the studios, and take over from within, He feels a certain amount of stealth is required. And I guess it's probably going to be a combination of both, They've pulled this kind of Saul Alinsky trick of infiltrating, cultural venues, especially universities and all that. Maybe we'll have to pull it back. I feel that we have to create our own. I feel a place like this where people can have a range of views is just terrific. And I think I personally would rather see it happen in a kind of defiant, open way. But the most important thing, as I keep telling people, is you got to make things. When Sean Penn won the Oscar and he got up and he made this kind of obnoxious speech, I criticized him. I have a blog on the culture and I criticized him. But the fact was, he gave an excellent performance in the film. It's a beautiful performance. And so he made the thing of beauty, and I criticized him for his speech. That means he wins that exchange. I had to do it. It was right for me to do it. But every time you make something and you become part of the culture and you partake of the culture, you win, if you do it well. And when you're just complaining about what somebody does, you're always 3 steps behind.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for coming tonight.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And I was just going to ask you, you say you write from ideas now. How then do you stay away from didacticism and preachiness in your literature?
Right. I was accused of it. It's funny, I was accused of it in this last book, and I feel it was a false accusation because I was writing a character who was thinking his way through something. So he did express a lot of ideas, some of which I didn't agree with, but I thought they were true to his character. You just have to make sure you're true to the character and the story. There's no magic